It is unusual for a monk to engage with the topic of how to negotiate one's sexual appetites.
No, it's not unusual at all.
Okay.
In the monastic tradition, you find that topic treated with tremendous honesty and practical good sense.
A long time ago.
Yes, going right back to the Desert Fathers.
Yes, it's unusual today, I suppose.
Today more so.
I think people have found it unusual. Yeah. I think that's one of the reasons why, they find your book intriguing.
I mean, part of the reason for writing it was precisely to try and bring people's attention to the wealth of insight and practical wisdom and life-giving wisdom that's there in the patrimony, which is part of the luggage we carry without realizing it's there in the suitcase.
One of the people I had never heard of before reading your book was Saint Mary of Egypt. I looked up online her story. It's sort of shocking, and she seems like a real saint for our age. Here's this woman who ran away from home when she was, I think, 13 or 14. Interesting enough, I was going to say she became a prostitute, but her early biographer, who was a desert father, an abbot, claims that she very frequently refused any payment.
Well, she says that herself when she meets this monk Zosimer, and she insists on this point that she gave herself up to this way of life not because of necessity, but because she wanted it, because her desire was insatiable. And she insists on the fact that she didn't need to because she was a professional woman, she was a rope maker. So she had the skill and the competence to make a living by honest means. And she did this because she enjoyed it.
Yes. And then she took a pilgrimage to the Church of the Holy
Well, I mean, it's not strictly true that she went on a pilgrimage. She joined a group of pilgrims. She was down at the port in Alexandria, and she saw all these young men boarding a ship, and she asked, "Where are you going?" And they said they're going to Jerusalem for the feast of the exaltation of the Holy Cross. And she said to herself, very callously, "Oh, wouldn't that be an interesting challenge to see if I can seduce these men who are set on this journey for a very pious purpose?"
So not a pilgrimage.
No, so she came with them, and she succeeded. When they arrived in Jerusalem, she thought, well, since I'm here, I may as well do a bit of tourism. So she walked around the town, and she saw the assembled pilgrims who flocked towards the basilica, where the relic of the Holy Cross was on display. But when she tried to enter the church, she says an invisible force pushed her back, and she was unable to enter. And it was the first time in her life that she had not been able to get what she wanted. And that produced a sort of a deep inner shock in her. And she realized in her perplexity that at that moment she wanted actually nothing other than to see this relic which everyone else had come to see.
Right.
And coming to this realization that there was something that was beyond the reach of her grasp, if you like, she suddenly realized what her life had become, and she was filled with this tremendous grief. And that's when up on the corner of a house, she sees an image of the Mother of God. And so she, who wasn't a praying woman, fell to her knees and said, "Mother of God, help me, let me enter this church and let me see the cross, and then we'll see what happens." And then she found that she could enter the church, and her life radically altered.
And then she became a great desert mother and teacher.
She, well, at that point, when she left the church, she decided to begin a new life and to conform her life to this cross whose material relic she had seen. So she picked up a loaf of bread and she crossed the River Jordan, went into the wilderness, and there started devoting herself to a life of prayer and penance. Also, that's a very striking, and I think, as you say, a very pertinent aspect of the story for our times. she had to consciously remember her way through everything she had lived up to that point.
So she was tormented by these memories for 17 years that corresponded to the 17 years that she lived.
Yes, and she insists on the fact that the memory lived in her body, that her body remembered the pleasure it had felt, and that it was, and that she yearned for the food and the wine and the sweet things she had known, and that sometimes that remembrance filled her with a desire that could seem overpowering. And at such times, she said, there was only one thing to do, and that was to throw myself on the ground and pray, Lord Jesus, have mercy on me. Mother of God, help me. And she could remain like that for a whole day.
Right.
Until this memory and the desire it provoked passed. And that lasted, she says, for a period of 17 years, so corresponding to her life spent in license, if you like. And then she says, and that too is an important lesson, then it was taken away. And then she could embark on a new existence of freedom, where her remorse, her sorrow was kept alive inwardly, but she was relieved of that physical pain of remembrance. That, if you like, the incarnate wound had been healed.
It is one of the strange sort of paradoxes of Catholic spirituality and Catholic culture that, okay, we had a very nice reindeer stew here yesterday on arrival in Trondheim, and that was wonderful. But generally, Protestant countries are not famous for their wine and for their food and for their, you go to Catholic countries and suddenly everything feels very incarnate. There's a huge amount of colour, there's shrines everywhere, people have these big festivals and huge feast days, and everything feels very bodily. And you go into the Vatican, and I think it was the nihilistic artist Francis Bacon who talked about Michelangelo as the only artist who truly understood what he called the voluptuousness of the human body. It's one of these kind of strange aspects of Catholic spirituality that there's this real privileging of pleasure, of the experience of pleasure. And then at the same time, there's this long tradition of treating it as, in some way, a potential enemy of spiritual transformation.
I think I might want to slightly qualify that. I'm not sure it's pleasure as such, which is. I think pleasure is taken seriously in Catholic thought and art, but I think that whole patronage points more deeply to the sacramental nature of created goods, and the fact that you can savor and enjoy and rejoice in the goodness of a lovely meal, or a glass of wine, or a piece of music, or a painting, and that invites you to give thanks, which is a way of lifting up your heart, and it invites you to reflect that this good thing, which is here within reach and given me to take pleasure in, comes from somewhere and is given by someone, and is fully itself, but at the same time points beyond itself.
The world as gift.
Yes, exactly.
I think Gregory Nazianzen talks about the whole world as a sacrament.
Yes, it's something which is deep in the tradition, more explicitly of the Greek than the Latin fathers.
Right. Although even Thomas Aquinas, we're very used to talking about the 7 sacraments, but he also talks about not just the sacraments of the Old Covenant, like circumcision and sacrifice and so on, but also the natural sacraments, sacraments of nature, Aquinas talked about, which I think is an analogous concept.
Yes, and obviously, and one can use that term sacrament in a more non-specific sense as referring to realities that provide an opening to transcendence, yes, that are vehicles of transcendence, if you like.
Going back to your own decision to write Chastity, Reconciliation of the Senses, published by Bloomsbury in the UK, was this very much the fruit of your, immersing yourself in the texts of the Desert Fathers and Mothers and finding this tradition of engaging with this topic in a very thoughtful and mature way, and then...
Well, I mean, there was that, but there was also the experience of trying to make sense of my own life, also in its embodied aspect. And I think what provoked my decision to, eventually to write the book, but first of all to explore the topic, is the teaching of St. Benedict on chastity, which is elliptic in the extreme.
Love chastity.
Yes, exactly. It's 2 words in the 4th chapter, that inexhaustible chapter on the tools for good works. And I remember when I first, I'd read the rule obviously before entering the monastery, but when I started reading it attentively and thinking about what that might mean, my initial response was, what? What on earth is lovable about it? I could see it as being noble and heroic, and I think I'd thought of chastity in terms of of mortification and of sacrifice and oblation. But to think of it as being somehow amiable, that I couldn't quite work out. So that's why I set myself the task of discovering what might be the foundation of the lovability of chastity.
When I wrote my doctoral thesis, I devoted a very large section to the final monograph to the thought of Joseph de Maistre. Mm-hmm. And Maistre says in Du Pape, he has an extended section on sexual appetite. Mm. And he thinks that what the revolutionary epoch in Europe in the late 18th century was going to bring about was essentially a kind of crowning of our most demanding appetites, and that we're going to enter a new social paradigm in which the social flourishing itself was going to be understood through the prism of simply the emancipation of your appetites. That's what it was going to be. And he thought that this had the potential to unwind the whole of civilization. I know that you don't come from that perspective when you write your book, the greater political ramifications of this. But it does seem to me that if Maistre was onto something, the fact that your book is not simply a book written for other consecrated religious or priests, but is a book made available to everybody, and that a lot of lay people, a lot of non-Christians have picked it up and been moved by it, that in some way your book might be responding to some of those concerns raised right at the beginning of modernity.
I think, talk about the emancipation of the appetites. It's a nice idea, but I think most of us will have the personal experience that the emancipation of my appetites doesn't necessarily make me free.
Yes.
And ultimately, that's what we desire. And so we find ourselves locked in a kind of contradiction, which is complicated because it's such an embodied contradiction, that I seem to be getting what I want, and yet I'm not satisfied. And getting more of what I want may in fact make me feel imprisoned.
Well, Maistre says that there's no medium between grace and slavery, is his phrase.
Strong phrase.
Yeah. But of course, by slavery, he means a kind of interior slavery, where, it's the St. Augustine, I don't know if I'm quoting him or paraphrasing, but there's a line from the Confessions, I think it is, where he says, a man has as many masters as he has vices. So it's this notion of being interiorly fettered by your own kind of chaotic desires that are pulling you hither and thither, instead of being somebody, as Plato says, who has the reins, you know, that you are in some way master of your life.
If you live in such a way that you know where your life is going, if your life is oriented, if it is attracted towards a goal which is a desirable goal, St. Augustine in the Enchiridion says something like this, that to be truly free is to have no choice. That puzzled me when I first read it, and I couldn't make sense of it. But I think I can understand it more now. And what he means, I think, is that if I have such a clear notion of the good that my existence is set to pursue, that good will draw me so naturally and so joyfully that lesser goods that might distract me no longer pose serious alternatives. So I'm not anymore constantly pulled in all sorts of different directions, thinking, should I go there, or should I go here, or should I go there, or should I go here? Because I'm set on a trajectory, and I know the end that attracts me.
Well, but this is one of my criticisms of modern popular Christianity, that there seems to be a kind of absence of awareness of the principle of finality in the order of grace.
Yep. No, I would agree with that.
I mean, you are one of the, and I'm not trying to flatter you here, because actually I think it's a real indictment. I think that the fact that I only know of perhaps one bishop in the church who is talking often about theosis, deification, transformation in Christ, the divine intimacy, the end for which the Christian life exists, the end for which baptism is given to us, which is spousal transformation in intimacy with Christ, which is kind of strange, because that's the whole scriptural narrative. It begins with a marriage. The covenant's renewed through marriages. Christ begins his ministry at the wedding at Cana with his miracle, and then he calls himself the bridegroom, and then he's on the cross and he says consummatum est. He consummates his marriage with the church, and then the whole thing culminates in this great wedding feast of the Lamb, and the whole thing is filled with this spousal imagery of we are being called through baptism and through the sacramental life into intimacy with the incarnate Word. And yet, you know, since I became a Roman Catholic 15 years ago, almost nowhere have I heard this preached or discussed. It's kind of to become interested in the mystical tradition of the Church is almost treated as a kind of niche interest for some eccentric Christians, rather than the very heart of what Christianity is all about.
So it's not so surprising, really, that a lot of people reject the proposition as being uninteresting.
Right.
If it is shorn of that fundamental dimension of significance. In fact, it was the readings at vigils in the Divine Office this morning, from the first epistle of John, mundus transit et concupiscentia eius, the world is passing with its desire, which isn't to say that its desire is necessarily wicked, but it's non-final, and therefore, in an essential sense, not satisfactory.
But desire here is also an intimation of its final fulfillment in the kind of intimacy that I was alluding to.
Yep.
Is it Chesterton who says the man who knocks on the door of a brothel is out in search of a cathedral? I think
it certainly sounds like something he might have said.
It sounds Chestertonian, yep, doesn't it? But I think he's on to something, that all of our appetitive longings are,
No, it makes me think of something, since we're talking about the desert tradition earlier on. I had the great good fortune in about 2000 to spend some time doing research in Paris. That was before I joined the monastery. And I was interested in the work of Olivier Clément, the French Orthodox theologian, and I rang up the institute where he was teaching to ask whether he was still teaching, and so he was. So I attended his classes around his dinner table for a term with a small group of other people. And I remember one time he spoke about this strange sympathy one often finds in the tradition and in the literature between the great ascetics and the great sinners. This recognition that somehow the goal pursued is the same, but in one instance it's pursued in a confused and often self-sabotaging way. But the truly pure of heart will recognize the profound source of longing, which is propelling a life in that direction, and will feel a kind of reverence for it.
Well, one of my favourite scriptural passages, and it's a strange one to have as a favourite, but one of my favourite passages is at the beginning of the book of the Apocalypse, when the Lord says, "Since you are neither hot nor cold but lukewarm, I shall spew you forth from my mouth." And I've often thought, the really dangerous person is the person who's the kind of comfortable bourgeois person who just sort of, I'm a good person. I'm not so bad and I'm not so good. I go through life. I don't need to think. I don't need to be in a questioning relation with my existence. I just need to settle, make myself comfortable, and sort of drift through life. And I've often thought that to have a serious existential conversation about the human drama and why we've been thrown into existence and the imperatives that entails, that kind of person is almost impossible to speak to. Whereas the person who's sort of completely chaotic and is kind of grappling with life and their desires and constantly going through chaotic relationships and so on, you kind of think, this person is at least alive, right?
Yes. I suppose we could orchestrate that in a different key in terms of something that Elie Wiesel, the chronicler of Auschwitz, said when he received the Nobel Peace Prize in the City Hall in Oslo in the 80s, I think, when he said the opposite of love is not hatred. The opposite of love is indifference.
Oh.
Mm? And if I understand you correctly, I think we could label that fundamental attitude as a kind of an indifferent, the being neither hot nor cold.
So the passage that is strongly associated with the call to chastity is the passage from the Sermon on the Mount, "The pure of heart will see God." Mm-hmm. Beyond just the need for any human being to get a grip on their appetites just to function in this world as a mature human being, this imperative also gets assumed up, doesn't it, into the spiritual life.
Very much so.
And the point that you emphasize in your book is that a lack of chastity is deeply connected with seeing people almost exclusively from the perspective of use.
Yes, it corresponds to a relational blindness.
Right, exactly. And so chastity is the habit that, if I can put it this way, enables us to enter into truly interpersonal relations with others and thereby become persons.
Yes, even a preliminary to entering into relationship is that a chaste outlook on life and on the world and on other people enables me to recognize and acknowledge and honor the presence of the other without the calculation of how that person may or may not serve my purposes, my benefit or my pleasure. So that capacity of recognizing otherness, and to use that phrase again, it's a Benedictine phrase, which I think is crucial, that of honoring the other. It's something that dawned on me over several years, the importance of that term in the Rule of St. Benedict. He uses the verb honorare as a key motif by which to define relationships between brothers, and so interhuman relationships. And I think an unchaste outlook is in that sense a dishonorable outlook that sees the other in view of instrumentalization.
So perhaps if indifference is the opposite of love, then at least in deep kinship with love is something like a disinterested attitude towards somebody else,
which is again very much tied up with gratitude and wonder. I think it's a criterion, very practical criterion, by which we can evaluate our relationships. Am I conscious of the gift of this presence or not? Am I conscious of the unknowability of this person who's sitting opposite me? Or do I look upon him or her as someone I've worked out as an easy mathematical calculation that I can put in my pocket?
So maybe the ultimate expression of the chaste outlook is, when Moses ascends to God after the Israelites have worshipped or the Hebrews have worshipped the golden calf, and he says, "Take my name out of the book of life, if only you will show mercy to them." And I think most people at some point in their life have some experience of this. I remember my brother and I talking about becoming dads. He became a dad at a similar time as I did, and we both said, it's a very strange thing to look at another person, a little person with no experience or anything, and realise that you would happily not exist at all if it meant that would procure the flourishing of this person. It's
and what a wonderful insight to entertain.
I suppose this is why there's a tradition of seeing the clergy as this tradition, which is largely an Anglo tradition, actually, of calling priest father, because the kind of relation with which the faithful want to be with their own shepherds is that of a priest looking upon his people with such benignity that he can say, if I can procure the eternal beatitude of these people, then I will give my whole life as an oblation for that end.
And I think that it is a fundamental defining aspect of priesthood, that oblational dimension, that one is making of one's life an offering, conscious of its objective non-importance, but of its immense significance if and when united with the sacrifice of Christ, and one freely consents to live by the logic of the mystery celebrated on the altar.
Yeah.
It's a powerful formula that the bishop addresses to the newly ordained priest after the rite is finished, when he gives him the pattern and the chalice. And he says, understand what you celebrate and conform your life to the sacramental mystery. That is, live your life henceforth on Eucharistic terms. There's that marvelous book by Patrick Leigh Fermor, A Time to Keep Silence, which he wrote in the 50s, I think, when he was down in the dumps and he was tired and a bit depressed, and he thought he'd go and visit a monastery. So he visited 2 or 3 and wrote up a little book about it. And he goes first to the Benedictine monastery of Saint-Vendry in Normandy, which he loved and has written very beautifully about. And after that he goes to La Trappe, the mother house of the Trappists. He found that rather more forbidding. But he stayed in a guest house which was primarily for priests, and there was an internal cloister with devout sayings written on the walls to nurture the meditation of these devout priests in retreat. And he comes across this saying, Le prêtre est un homme mangé. So the priest is a devoured man, literally a man who's eaten. And he's shocked by it, but at the same time strangely attracted by it. And I remember when I read that account, I also found it shocking, but I'm more and more inclined to think that it expresses, rather starkly, something which is deeply true, and that it's crucial to rediscover and rearticulate. And it takes us precisely to the core of the mystery of what love is.
I lived in Ireland for a year in 2012, I think it was. And at that time, there was such intense anger over what is now referred to as the abuse crisis. And a lot of people said to me, I'll never go to church again, ever. I was kind of going out of habit, maybe not every Sunday, but now I'll just never step foot in a church ever again. And it struck me as a very reasonable response.
Yes.
It's a bit like when I hear stories of a parent abusing their own child. It's the perfect inversion of how I have come to understand what my parental role is, and so on.
And it really is it is unchastity taken to its most perverse extreme.
Right. Which I suppose really indicates the importance of a book like yours, where we have to rediscover chastity, not only because we've been faced with its perfect antithesis in the life of the church, because I've heard people say, it turns out the BBC were up to it, hospitals were up to it, it's not just the church. And you sort of think, well, hold on a minute.
But it's infinitely worse when
none of those institutions claim to be the treasury of grace.
No, exactly. And it acquires a dimension of evil which is specific to that context.
Yes. And so not only have we been faced with the antithesis of chastity, but we have to rediscover it, but we have to rediscover it as you present it, not as a virtue of negation, but as something truly affirming of the end for which we have been created at all.
And also, I like to insist on this aspect as an overcoming of fragmentation, because I think when lives go wrong in this area, clerical lives or other lives, it is often because people live with an inner dividedness and are pulled in different directions and start rationalizing desires which may be desires of compensation or needs for self-affirmation or the need to feel an autonomy expressed through power. And these unhealthy aspects of a personality, which can be irritating and ridiculous in the normal run of life, become hideous in their destructiveness when they morph almost into, you know, hypostatic entities, cut off from a person's normal and outward sense of appearance and public persona. And that is why this process of becoming chaste must set out from just honest self-knowledge and an acceptance and an ability to name those aspects of my life which may not be in order, and which may be in need of healing, correction, reorientation, setting out from a basis of humility and truth, in order then to be repaired, united, and by time and grace transformed. I think one of the reasons why it's useful to reflect on this topic is that it enables us to indicate the warning signs of chastity going off course, and if we have a kind of a phenomenology both of chastity and of unchastity, we can be wise to the to unhelpful developments which may escape my own notice, but which other people around me who love me and care for me and feel responsibility for me may notice and help me notice. Mm-hmm. We can thereby help one another to acquire that maturity which alone can lead to flourishing and freedom and fruitfulness, enabling us to live such life that will have a capacity to generate life in and for others, rather than feeding on the lives of others.
I don't talk about this very often because I find it slightly embarrassing to talk about it. But when I was, I think, 18 years old, I had an experience, a very strange, very unexpected experience of the love of God. Just walking into a local little countryside church, and suddenly this experience, and I don't know for how long this lasted, but it you know, it's what I suppose a kind of mystical encounter with God. And I remember walking out and looking around, and the whole world looked different. It looked sacramental. The whole world looked pregnant with meaning. I never really lost that initial sense that almost all the decisions I have ever made in my life have been in reference to that experience. All the choices I've made ever since then. I mean, I've made a lot of stupid choices, but I mean, all the big decisions I've made in my life have been in reference to that initial inspiration. And that coincided with a very deep sense that I had polluted myself. Like St. Peter says when he beholds the Lord and says, "You must get away from me, I'm a sinful man." And this sense that I was so unworthy of this infinite love that I had kind of tasted just the shadow of it, you know, and I thought all the decisions I have to make must be in pursuit of possessing whatever that was that I encountered at that moment. And I was very struck by, because it's all very well talking about these ideas and these virtues in the abstract, but you know, you've spoken extremely movingly about being a boy and listening to Mahler and it just transforming your vision of your life and of the world, and you trace the decisions that you have made, including to enter the monastery, you trace them in some way back to that initial experience.
Benedict Domine nos et hec tua dona, quid tua largitate sumus sumpturi, per Christum Dominum nostrum. Amen.
Amen.
Hallelujah. It is Easter tide.
Yes, I suppose so, yes. About Mahler.
Yes, well, it was an experience I had when I was 15. I'd always been very interested in music. I'd always been very touched by music. Music was a kind of a primary language to me from I was very small. And a friend of mine, or a friend of my sister's really, a bit older than me, was studying music and was telling me about Mahler, how impressed he was by the discoveries he kept making. And I was vain enough not to be able to admit that I'd never really listened to much Mahler. But I did go and splash out my savings on a couple of CDs next time I was in Oslo. And so I bought a copy of his second symphony, the Resurrection Symphony, simply because I knew the performers. It was a Leonard Bernstein recording, and I decided I would listen to it one evening when I was on my own at home. So my family had gone out. I settled in the living room with this music, listened to the first movement, the second movement, the third movement, the fourth movement, which is, as you will know, a solo movement with the contralto singing a song from the cycle Das Knaben Wunderhorn, about this soul on a search, walking along a road and encountering all sorts of obstacles and meeting an angel. And then that fourth movement ends very, very serenely. Then the fifth movement begins with just a chaotic noise, corresponding almost to the beginning of creation. I did that on purpose. Little by little, there is a rhythmic pattern that establishes itself, and then a melodic pattern. And then the orchestra comes in, and then little by little the choir comes in, and then a soprano soloist comes in and sings this text, which is Mahler's own, words that are very simple. O Glaube, du warst nicht umsonst geboren, hast nicht umsonst gelebt, gelitten. Believe this, you were not born in vain, not born for nothing. You haven't lived and you haven't suffered in vain. Now, I was 15 at the time. It wasn't as if I'd lived and suffered all that much. But I was so struck by this message, and I was just overwhelmed by the truth of it. The self-evidence was perfect. And it was as if, as the music continued, something just burst within me, a dam. And it was a dam that revealed something alive, which was intimate to me and familiar somehow, but I had the awareness and the conviction that it was at the same time greater than I, that I was somehow with somebody, that there was a presence there. And so I listened to the rest of the music in a sort of stunnedness. And when it had finished, I sat there in the silence and in the darkness, thinking not very much. But reflecting after a while, it'll be interesting to think about this tomorrow when it'll have passed. And then the next day it hadn't passed. This openness, a sort of a wound in a way, was there. And this awakening to the presence remained real. And so that's how the search began.
As you were speaking, well, many questions were rising in my mind, but I suppose I want to tie it into our conversation earlier. I was thinking of something I like about your story is that whilst it is an experience of the mystical realm, it is an experience which is also of the ordinary world. that sometimes you hear these stories of, oh, well, my conversion began with having this vision of the Virgin Mary or something. You sort of come across these stories and you think, well, I'm not too sure how that relates to my own experience or whatever. Whereas so many people have, for example, Kathleen Raine, the poet, talks about an experience of just sitting, writing at the dining table and looking up at a small bouquet of flowers and suddenly becoming aware that the entire cosmos was alive, that it wasn't simply an artifact of the divine will, but it was rather an emanation of the divine being, and that the whole world around her was theophanic, and this being a kind of a chapter-turning moment in her life, but it unfolded out of something as quotidian as looking up at a vase full of flowers.
And I think people actually have those experiences all the time.
Yes,
the trouble is
so.
we haven't got or we've lost, or we've even willfully forgotten the conceptual framework to make sense of them.
Yes.
But I think any experience of beauty, of the gratuity of beauty, of being faced with something that exceeds me, yet doesn't threaten to devour me, fills us with that sort of reverence, which is intrinsic to humanity, I think. And I think one of the great sort of faith tasks of today, and one of the great spiritual tasks, is to re-equip people to make sense of that sort of experience.
Yes. I've often wondered whether Vermeer was the artist of the sacrament of the present moment. Because we know that he had this conversion to Catholicism. He only painted one painting that was explicitly religious, the Allegory of Faith. All of his paintings freeze in time and reveal something completely mundane, tasting some wine, pouring some milk, these kind of totally mundane things. And yet, he presents these images as pregnant with existential meaning, that actually the milkmaid pouring the milk is an event that is unfolding out of this kind of providence-driven world. And I've often wondered whether Vermeer is the artist par excellence in this regard. He delivers what's happening around us all the time, but he presents it to us anew so that we can see it as pregnant with meaning.
And I think, to pick up a theme from earlier on, I think Vermeer is a very good example of someone who sees chastely.
Interesting.
And precisely has reacquired that eye.
Cheers.
Cheers. It's a phrase in one of St. Bruno's letters. Bruno, the founder of the Charterhouse, when he's in the last stage of his life in the Charterhouse in Calabria, and he writes to his friend Raoul and speaks of the happiness of living the contemplative life, and he says, here is where the eye is acquired. That sees things and sees beyond things.
You quote that in the book.
Yep.
And it's very moving.
And I think we see that in some artists. And I agree. I think Vermeer is almost the textbook example. And the extraordinary thing is that by seeing one of his canvases and pausing in front of it, not just to photograph it with my iPhone and run on, it's as if by seeing through someone else's chaste eyes, my own vision is chastised.
Yeah. That's a very nice way to put it. Oh, fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. Gosh, I wouldn't have been filling up on bread had I known it was going to be such a huge salad.
That's a large starter.
Yeah.
Enjoy.
3 courses was definitely right.
Yes, I think that's better than 7.
Yeah. I want to go back to something you said earlier about encountering the divine presence and yet having this experience that it's not going to devour you. There is a devouring aspect, I think, to this. And I think this links to your thoughts on chastity. The fact that the mystics repeatedly speak in sexual terms about their experience of God, and you have, Bernini's marble image of Teresa of Avila and the angel piercing her heart, and many art historians have commented on this kind of, if it's not impious to say so, a kind of orgasmic experience that's being portrayed there. That interpretation is justified, but I think it's also, it is reductionist, and it shows that the only vocabulary with which we can now conceive of transcendent experience is sexual. But certainly, it is language which is intrinsic to the Christian, indeed the biblical imagination, largely owing to the immense significance of the Song of Songs in the fashioning through millennia of mystical aspiration. Saint Bernard is the great authority on this text.
Yes, he reflected on it and preached on it all his life, and even doing so, he only covered about a generous third of the book,
right,
in his commentaries.
Thomas Aquinas had it read to him on his deathbed. John of the Cross had it read to him on his deathbed. It seems like the text that is most beloved of the great mystical and great saintly figures of the Church's history.
Yes, and there's a there's a Jewish prehistory to that. There's a tradition in rabbinic Judaism that would maintain that the Song of Songs is of all the Bible's holy book the holiest,
right?
Because it suggests the profoundest mystery, which is this mystery of a possibility of communion between the uncreated source of all and dust.
Maybe it is reductionist in the way you suggest, but I had a sense quite early on in my life that, as a young man, as a boy becomes a young man, becomes a teenager, one is faced with these appetitive impulses that are almost all-consuming. And I had a sense quite early on, strangely I suppose, that if these appetites were not in some way assumed into a religious impulse, even if I would not have articulated it in that way, they possess the power to consume me, to devour me, to use your term. And it seemed to me that in some way a very deep spiritual life must be bound up with the sexual appetite in a very kind of complex and sophisticated way. It must be, otherwise you get interior disintegration.
Yes, and one has seen examples of that.
Yeah.
And I think we're back to the oblative dimension again of Christian and of human living. That of, we talked about that earlier on, of a real encounter presupposing a readiness for dispossession. And that dispossession has to be all-embracing. I mean, there too we have, we have the biblical image, the paradigm of the Holocaust, of the entire offering. Mm-hmm. And that suggests the totality of openness and of self-giving. And it points towards the great and really profoundly theological human challenge of living the spiritual life in a way which is humanly credible and has human integrity. I rather suspect that we're all more or less implicit dualists at heart, and that we find it extremely difficult, even if we stand piously and say it in church on a Sunday, to believe in the resurrection of the flesh.
Right.
To believe that even my embodied being is endowed with a supernatural and an eternal vocation, and is called to glory.
And that grace isn't simply something that has an effect in the soul, but it transforms the entire person, and it transforms the relationship of reason and will to the appetites, to the emotions, to the imagination, to the integrity of the whole person.
And beautifies the person.
Uh-huh. It was largely, whatever we mean by the West and our civilization, was largely a creation of the church. It was, it's true that we have this very important Hellenic tradition that's pre-Christian, and perhaps even its most important aspects are post the life of Christ. You know, the importance of the thought of Plotinus and Proclus and Porphyry in the early church and its engagement with that, even though they were competitors. So it's true that there's that. It's true that there's also a national tradition and a low cultural tradition in the West. It's also true that there is a imperial Roman legal tradition. There are all of those things. But whatever we mean by the West, it seems to me, is the engagement with those things, the transformation of those things, the assumption of them into the supernatural life, and in many senses, their inversion, right? I mean, you think of the kind of ideal of the Roman warrior, this kind of depersonalized killing machine, the Roman legionary. You compare that to, you know, the Christian knight, who may not have always lived up to the ideals of chivalry, but nonetheless had different ideals to the Roman legionary. The church transformed all of it, and whatever we mean by the civilization to which we're heirs is a kind of creation of the church, or a recreation of the church. And a lot of people identify that this came about in large part because of two phenomena. One, the willingness of bishops to preach the gospel, and two, the establishment of monastic settlements that went through the daily process of consecrating a particular area in the land and the tenant farmers and the lives of everyone. Now, you can lay claim to both of those, being both a monk and a bishop. Looking around, what do you want to say to our ebbing civilization?
Well, the principal thing I want to say as a monk and as a bishop is that death is dead and Christ is risen, and hope is reborn, and that no betrayal is beyond remedy. Mm-hmm. And as we talked about earlier on, that no fragmentation is final, that integrity is possible, that society is possible, that there is such a thing as the common good and that we're responsible for it, and that the construction of it is not only beneficial but joyful. Those are some of the things I would say.
Do you see modern day Norway, or more broadly Scandinavia, as a place that is now possibly receptive to such a message? I mean, after all, this is your territory.
Much more so than I'd expected, actually, coming back here in 2020 after 30 years abroad. And clearly, I mean, ours is a very secularized setting, but in some ways, secularization has sort of played itself out here. It's done. It's no longer a motivating factor. And we find ourselves faced with this accomplishment, if you can call it that, or a fait accompli. And people discover that they still seek meaning, and they still want to draw the lines between the points, and they still want to hear the different voices in symphony. So I think there is a case to be made for saying that we've entered a new cultural, societal, sociological phase of a post-secularization, where the norm is no longer a rebellion against the church or religion or the institutions of religion, but the new norm is a kind of curiosity and a desire to learn, which can of course be superficial and marked by all sorts of vanities, but which often has a note of remarkable sincerity. And I do find that to be a feature of the encounters I make in the most varied circumstances.
Interesting. I mean, I think it has caused some surprise to people who follow online controversies that, you know, the conservative American commentator Candace Owens was just received into the Catholic Church just recently. Russell Brand has just been baptized. You have all of these figures who seem to be opting into Christianity. It's almost as if that sort of the old Christian view that in many respects the church seems to be quite embarrassed about now, that essentially the unconverted world is the principality of Satan, and that Christ has entered the world to establish a new kingdom, and that its temporal manifestation is Christendom, and that's going to be the way out. It's like people who have immersed themselves in the deceptions of the world have realised how true that old message is. So it might be a very exciting time.
Mm-hmm. So at the same time, it's a message that needs to be qualified. Qualified a little bit. I think it's very important in a Christian context not to adopt a perspective on the world which is too dark and
Manichaean.
Yes, exactly, and again, and to resist, because there too there is a dualist trap, and to remember that Christ, who is Judge and Redeemer, is also the one by whom and for whom and in whom everything was made, and that there is that there is a trace of that primordial goodness in things. And even in societies, and that it is important to have eyes that see that and that are capable of evoking and provoking it.
But isn't that why the world is worth redeeming? And
absolutely. It's supremely worth redeeming.
Agreed. But nonetheless, there is, I think, a strong theme in Christianity, and I think it's a very important scriptural theme, that this glorious, beautiful world that was made through the eternal Logos and is a communication of God and is our proper home and must be redeemed, has nonetheless been placed under a kind of legal jurisdiction that's diabolical. And that's why when Christ says that the devil is the prince of this world, and St. Paul says he's the god of this world.
But the prince of this world has been conquered. That was, in fact, that happened to me, the reading at Mass this evening. So it is, there is, as it were, an ancien régime, which is furiously trying to hold on to its right, but it has no hope. And it's also important, while being realistic in that regard, it's important not to give it more attention than it deserves. And not to become fascinated by dysfunction and woundedness and evil.
Maybe not to become fascinated by them, but to acknowledge that there are a lot of good people whose lives are ruined by the promises of late modernity. Mm-hmm. And there are a lot of young people who carry the spiritual and in some cases the physical wounds of those promises. And I think unless we're prepared to acknowledge the diabolical character of that, I mean that is what we renounce at baptism, right? Mm-hmm. All of his promises, all of his pomps, everything, right?
Yeah, and that is a promise to be taken seriously.
Right, it seems so. And I don't think that's to be fascinated by it, it's just to acknowledge the seriousness of the drama into which we have been thrown, in the drama we found ourselves in, and the way to respond that has been made available to us.
Mm-hmm. Oh, no, I, absolutely. I mean, life is a business that requires a response of great seriousness, but a response that is all the same illumined by the accomplishment that has taken place. It's all played out. I mean, even you know what the fathers call the mysterium iniquitatis, the mystery of iniquity and the manifestations of evil. It is played out tragically and woundingly in a perspective of glory, which is a certain perspective.
Thank you very much.
I often think of, and I cite now and again, one of Pascal's pensées, which I think one must take very, very seriously. That he says, Christ remains in agony until the end of the world. That's not time to be slept away. And that, there is that great work of redemption, of restoration going on now, in which we are caught up, through the mystical body, which is implicated in an ongoing actualization of the passion, and yet at the same time, the resurrection is an historical fact, and is final. So it's acquiring the spiritual tools and the patience to remain within that tension. And the word patience is a significant one. Obviously, in the Latin patientia, there is the passio.
Yes.
St. Benedict says towards the end of the prologue to his rule that by patience, per patientiam, participamur passionibus Christi. So by patience we participate in the passion of Christ. And that stature of patience is intrinsic to the human and Christian condition, and at times it can be lacerating in the pain it inflicts, and yet even at such times we must see beyond. That's what I'm getting at.
I suppose I'm the reason I'm pushing back a little bit is because if you were to ask me whether I thought evil was inherently interesting, I would say no. I would say it's not inherently interesting, and
it is by definition dull.
It's by definition
because there is no originality in it.
It's parasitic always on something that is and is good. Yes, I agree. And actually, one of the things that people repeatedly say who have to work with serial killers or, people who have carried out acts of extreme evil. Thank you very much.
Tack ska du ha.
Something that people often say is, you're often kind of shocked at how pathetic and empty these people are. There's nothing kind of intriguing or fascinating. It's just total hollowness. So when we say, well, let's not get fascinated by this, I agree with you. On the other hand, I think about things like the abortion statistics, family breakdown. The way that, the philosopher Joseph Milne talks about how all of the human achievements reflect our ability to apprehend the proper meaning of the universe. So jurisprudence should reflect our understanding of justice. Art should reflect beauty. All of these, each time we're sort of, and what he says is, so if you have a breakdown of those things, it's because you're now blind to reality. And what I see is everything getting uglier, the political system becoming less and less just, the way the medical system entering into greater and greater medical malpractice, everything sort of disintegrating and breaking down. And whilst we might say, well, that's not as interesting as a just society, or that's not as interesting as beautiful art, or any of those things, fine. But we have to take it very seriously. And I think it behooves a Christian to see the suffering entailed by such a breakdown.
Of course,
and be heartbroken by it.
There is a moral imperative implicit in it. And yet at the same time, what one's got to, you know, look out for and recognize and nurture what is good, and the real presence of light and beauty within a setting of, I mean, in so many ways, of decadence. I think that there's...
You don't want me to lead people into despair.
No, I don't, and I don't think there's any. And believe me, I mean, one of the great privileges of being a pastor is that one encounters people in
real despair,
in situations of great vulnerability and a great suffering. But at the same time, one encounters again and again the extraordinary resilience of hope, and the possibility, the real possibility of the transformation of situations, and the real, and I don't mean this in any trite way, but the real difference that can be made by an investment in what is good. And you know, anyone who has a view of the present which is in any way historically informed is aware that, you know, the world has passed through times of decadence and loss of purpose before, and that such times have sometimes, not always, but actually surprisingly often led into new eras of creativity, of humanity, of a refinement, of human creation. And I think the crucial task of now is to facilitate, to prepare, and to wait for the resurgence that will come, and to look out for the signs of it, and to foster those signs, to nourish and nurture them.
Although you in your book, obviously it leapt out of me for obvious reasons, that there's a moment in your book where you use a hunting metaphor, and you say the church should not be like an old spaniel puffing along trying to keep up with the hunt.
Well remembered.
Yeah. That entails, it seems to me, that the church shouldn't simply wait patiently and try to understand the signs of the times, but must in some way be...
No, but I wasn't talking about waiting, I was talking about nurturing.
Right.
And that is, I mean, anyone who's worked in a greenhouse knows that there is a degree of waiting implicit in nurturing, and any mother, any father knows that. But yet that is, it is a supremely active state of being. And that, I mean, we can't afford, because that too is boring, just to be sitting around and constantly asking, well, where are we now, and where is this going? But to have sufficient trust in the unchanging, eternally oriented coordinates of the Christian tradition, or the condition, to invest them in the presence with confidence, with hope. I would say, to use a scriptural term, which is now, I suppose, a controversial term, with virility. That is, with a generative purpose, and to risk. So what I'm advocating is in no way an attitude which just leans back to see what happens. But it's
which
rather
would be complacency.
Yes, no, and that doesn't take anyone anywhere.
I said to you earlier that you're one of the few leading pastors in the church who time and again emphasizes mystical transformation as the heart of the Christian life.
Realistic transformation. Well, it seems to me that that's what I was ordained to do.
Do you ever feel lonely in advancing that message?
No, I can't say so, because
Or alone, I should say.
There's a, one of the marvelous things about living and operating within the church is that you're part of this chorus of voices
Down the centuries.
Yes, exactly, and the noise it makes is phenomenal.
Mm-hmm. It is also nice to be joined by living people as well.
Yes, and they do exist. I mean, what I would say now, it's entirely banal, but I believe profoundly in the purposefulness of existence.
Mm-hmm.
And the purposefulness, not just in the sense that we all have the capability and the potential to do good and useful and happy things, but that you, that I, that each person existing exists for a finality of glory. And exists to remain forever ourselves in our deepest truth, but at the same time to become something unutterably greater than our notion of ourselves, and that there is, that each of us is an ongoing work of creation through an energy and a grace of redemption, and that purpose is, but this isn't a controversial term. It's a scriptural term from the second letter of Peter, that we are called to become participants in the divine nature.
Yeah.
And that is, at the end of the day, the only hermeneutic key that suffices to make sense both of our desire and our pain, of our deepest frustrations and of our most sublime longing.
Uh-huh.
And it is wonderful, and sometimes I'm overwhelmed by the wonder of it, to see that actually going on in individual lives. And I do see that.
You know, in a piece that I wrote recently for the European Conservative, I opined that having identified a number of problems that I see in Eastern Orthodoxy and a number of problems that I see in Latin Christianity, and it may have been slightly superficial, but there's only so much you can convey in a single article, that I saw the only solution to these problems to be the reunification of the Apostolic Church. Do you see that to be something very pressing, or even part of your own mission to try and bring about some kind of reconciliation?
I mean, it is an imperative, I'd say, and we all need to do what we can to make it possible. Obviously, I mean, it is an enormous task, but I mean, in some ways, I think you know, theologically, much work has been done, but there is the much more complicated business of reconciling sensibilities and also reconciling oneself to the wounds of history. Because obviously there has been a lot of mutually inflicted damage.
Sure. But another Council of Florence moment could be possible in the not too distant
I don't
future.
perhaps foresee it for this coming decade.
Sure.
But one can hope.
Century?
Oh, I haven't got the makings of a prophet.
So, you know, a lot of our viewers are not Roman Catholic. On both sides of the Atlantic, we have people who are broadly conservative in their worldview, most of whom have a great respect for ecclesiastical institutions as essentially conservative institutions, as institutions that are, you know,
with a patrimony.
With a patrimony, and how shall I put this? Civilizational treasuries in their own rights, I suppose, something like that. But I expect from many of our viewers, this will be the first time that they're hearing a Roman Catholic bishop in conversation speaking. And I suppose what I want to ask you is, what do you want to say to those people?
Again, there, I mean, I wouldn't presume to spout any sort of universal message.
Your own message.
I can share something that I think about a lot. There's a verse in a psalm, the Psalms ascribed to David, that has long puzzled me, and that seems to me to be of exceptional relevance for the times in which we live. And it's a line that goes, "They feared where there was no fear."
Huh.
And it seems to be very relevant to the present moment, because ours are such anxious times. I mean, I meet in my profession a lot of anxious people. I'm conscious of fears in my own heart. I look around, I travel around. I had the privilege of visiting Ukraine not so long ago. I have a strong connection with Western Cameroon, where there's basically a civil war going on that no one speaks about much. I meet and encounter people who've been through extremely perilous situations in their public and extremely private lives. I read the press like everyone else, and I see a society, I mean our Western society, that is extremely conditioned by fear. And fear is a dangerous impulse, because it is prone to make us irrational. And fear is prone to nurture anger, which is the mother of all the passions. that blinds us more than anything else. So I have this pet theory that one of the really important civilizational tasks at the moment is to identify our real fears, because the things we think we might fear aren't necessarily things that really make us afraid. Mm. And I think both in terms of our personal and in terms of our corporate lives, it's essential to face that challenge, to have the honesty and the humility and the patience to ask, what am I really frightened of? And is there fear there? You know, they're feared where there was no fear. Because so much of our deep, visceral fear is a projected fear. And in that case, it's important to follow the projection and ask where that comes from. But it seems to me that we often make tremendous and catastrophic mistakes acting to alleviate or to circumvent or to try to obliterate imagined fears through a failure of facing what we're really frightened of. So I think that's, as I said, that's simply a hunch I'd like to share, that I think it is important in our political and in our private lives that we pursue rigorously and analytically and with great honesty that question, where do our fears come from and what do they tell us? And where is our real chance of finding security and the possibility of hope?
I'm told that in the Holy Bible, the phrase "fear not" or "do not fear" comes up 365 times. So there's a passage for every day of the year telling us not to fear. Mm-hmm. So if we're of the opinion that the Holy Ghost inspired those texts, he seems to agree with your sentiments.
The necessary preliminary for overcoming fear is owning fear. And I think that's where we often fall short, because fear is humiliating. Because fear involves an owning of my non-omnipotence and of my non-capacity perhaps to rescue and save myself in a given situation. But that's why I think it is so important to follow that impulse to its root and then to tackle it there.
Dear Sebastian, thank you for pleasant and interesting exchanges yesterday. I'm not at my most clear thinking in the late evening. Déformation professionnelle after 20 years of life in a Trappist monastery. I woke up this morning to reflect that what I'd intended to be implicit in my final statement about fear probably wasn't very clear. I spoke of the importance of discernment in fear, of working out what one is really afraid of. What I would have added is this. Once you've found your fear, let love find you there. Call it forth in yourself there. Love in the sense we talked about, sitting out on that bench looking over the fjord. Clear-sighted, oblative, non-possessive, capable even in extreme situations of honouring otherness. Fear will loosen its grip. An uncanny freedom will spread its wings. Negotiated in this way, fear can be the beginning of wisdom.